The wind whispered through the fields, rustling the wheat like a mother's gentle touch. Spring had come to our little town, painting everything in hues of green and gold. It was the kind of town where people knew each other by name, where laughter echoed through the streets, and where Sunday mornings were spent on wooden church benches, heads bowed in quiet prayer. It was a town of peace, or at least, it had been. I remember the day he arrived. Jack. He had come through the valley, his frame weary but his eyes sharp. There was something about him, something that made my husband, Robert, take a liking to him instantly. He was a hard worker, knew his way around the land, and had hands that spoke of a man who had done more than his fair share of labor. Robert took him under his wing, and before long, Jack was like a son to us. We had never been blessed with children of our own, and in a strange way, he filled that space in our hearts. He never spoke much about where he came from, but there was a sadness in him, a weight he carried that no young man should bear alone. Then, there was Lillian. Sweet, bright-eyed Lillian. The baker's daughter, full of life and laughter. She had a way of making even the coldest days feel warm. I saw the way Jack looked at her, the way his walls would crumble just a little when she was near. And I saw the way she looked at him, like he was something rare and wonderful. For the first time since he arrived, I thought maybe, just maybe, Jack had found something worth staying for. But peace is a fragile thing, and happiness even more so. It started with whispers. Rumors floating through town like smoke from a dying fire. Then came the night when everything changed. A murder. My Robert, my love, my partner, was gone. They said Jack did it. They swore it. And just like that, the town that had embraced him turned against him. But I knew the truth. And so did Lillian. Because we knew what no one else did. We knew about the man from Jack's past. The one who had followed him here, hiding in the shadows, waiting for his chance to strike. The one who had truly taken Robert from me. Jack had no choice but to run. He left behind the only home he had ever known, the only love he had ever dared to dream of. And we were left with the truth, a truth we could never tell. And so, I sit here now, watching the sunset over these same golden fields, whispering his name into the wind. Jack. The wandering shadow. The boy who became my son. The man who lost everything, once again. I never thought I'd see the day when I'd call a drifter my own son. But here we were. Robert and I had taken in Jack as if he was flesh and blood, and the strange thing was, it didn't feel odd. It felt natural. Like he belonged here all along. I remember the first time I saw him with Robert, fixing up that old fence that had been falling apart for years. Robert had always been a proud man, reluctant to accept help, but with Jack, he was different. He let him in. And Jack, well, he took to the work like he had done it his whole life. There was a quiet determination in him, like he was trying to prove something, to himself, to the world, maybe to the ghosts of his past. It wasn't just the work, though. It was the way he laughed at my terrible jokes, the way he sat at the dinner table like he'd been there 100 times before. It was the way he always made sure I wasn't carrying anything too heavy, or how he watched over Robert like a son would his father. And then there was Lily. Sweet, bright-eyed Lily. The girl had a heart big enough to hold the whole world in it, and I think Jack knew it from the start. He was hesitant at first, keeping his distance, but she never let him. She had this way of pulling people in, making them feel safe, making them feel wanted. And Jack, oh, how he wanted to be wanted. I saw the way he looked at her when he thought no one was watching. Like he was afraid to reach out and take hold of something good, something pure. Like he didn't deserve it. But Lily, bless her soul, didn't let that stop her. She'd find him wherever he was, sitting on the porch, wandering the fields, lost in his own head, and she'd talk to him. About everything and nothing. And he listened. really listened. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I watched them sitting on the wooden fence by the barn. She was talking, smiling, swinging her feet, and he was just staring at her, as if memorizing every little detail. I don't think Jack had ever let himself dream of a future before, but in that moment, I swear, he was dreaming. But dreams don't last forever, do they? The peace we had built, the fragile happiness Jack had found, it was all about to come crashing down. Because someone from his past was coming. Someone dangerous. Someone who wouldn't think twice about ripping it all away. And Jack knew it. He always knew that peace wasn't made for men like him. I remember the way Jack sat on our porch that evening, his gaze lost in the setting sun. The golden light stretched across the fields, washing over him in soft, warm hues. But there was something distant in his eyes, something unreachable. "You all right, son?" My voice was gentle, careful not to startle him from his thoughts. Jack blinked, as if waking from a dream, and offered a small smile. "Yeah. Just thinking." That was Jack. Always thinking. Always caught somewhere between being here and being elsewhere. It was as if he wanted to settle, to belong, but some invisible force kept pulling him away. Lily stepped onto the porch, holding a glass of sweet tea in her hands. She offered it to him with a smile so full of warmth, it could have melted the hardest of hearts. "You've been working too hard today. Drink up." He took the glass with a nod of thanks. "You two treat me too well." I chuckled, settling into my rocking chair. "Nonsense. You're family now, Jack. Ain't no different from if you were our own blood." A flicker of something crossed his face, pain, disbelief, maybe even gratitude. He looked down at his drink, as if unsure how to respond. But I could tell he wanted to believe it. Maybe even needed to. The days passed, and the more time Jack spent here, the more I saw him come to life. He laughed with us, helped fix the barn, played with the neighbors' kids when they stopped by. He was still a man of shadows, still carrying something heavy in his soul, but here, he seemed lighter. More at peace. And then, he showed up. I was in the kitchen when I heard the front door creak open. Jack had gone to town that morning, and I expected him back later, but something about the way the door opened, slow, deliberate, set my nerves on edge. I turned, and there he was. A man I had never seen before, but one who carried an air of something sinister. He was tall, wary, with piercing eyes that darted around like he was always searching for something, or someone. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice steady but firm. He smiled, but there was no kindness in it. "I'm looking for an old friend." Something inside me whispered danger. "Jack." "Don't know who you're talking about," I said, keeping my expression neutral. The man tilted his head, studying me. "Oh, I think you do." My heart pounded, but I kept my ground. "Ain't no strangers welcome in my home, sir. I suggest you move along." His eyes flickered with amusement, like he was enjoying this little exchange. Then, with a slow nod, he turned and walked out the door, disappearing into the dusk. I stood there for a long while, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. Jack was in trouble. And whether he wanted to or not, he had brought that trouble right to our doorstep. The evening air carried the scent of fresh rain, the kind that settled into the earth and made the whole world smell like home. I sat on the porch, rocking gently in my chair, my hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea. Jack was fixing the old fence, hammering away as the last streaks of sunlight painted the sky in warm gold and soft lilac. Lillian sat beside me, her fingers absently twisting strands of her hair as she watched him work. She had grown fond of him, that much was clear. And if I wasn't mistaken, Jack had grown fond of her, too. I could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed when she was near, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. He'd never say it outright, he wasn't that kind of man, but I had lived long enough to read between the lines. "He's something else, isn't he?" Lillian murmured, almost to herself. I smiled, taking a sip of my tea. "That he is, sweetheart." She turned to me, a wistful look in her eyes. "Do you think he'll stay?" I sighed, my heart heavy with the weight of the truth. "I hope so. But men like Jack, they don't get to stay in one place for long." Her face fell slightly, but she nodded. She understood, even if she didn't want to. She had seen the shadows in his eyes, just as I had. Jack carried something dark inside him, something he tried to bury beneath the kindness he showed us. But ghosts don't stay buried forever. Just as I was about to say something more, I caught movement in the distance. A lone figure stood at the edge of our property, half shrouded in the dimming light. My stomach clenched. It was him. The man who entered the house. Even from here, I could feel the wrongness of him, the way his presence soured the air like curdled milk. He didn't belong in a place like this. And yet, here he was, watching. Waiting. Jack must have sensed it, too, because he straightened, his entire body tensing like a predator catching the scent of danger. He turned slowly, locking eyes with the man across the field. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, the stranger smirked, a slow, deliberate thing, and lifted his hand in a mock salute before turning and vanishing into the tree line. Lillian shivered beside me. Who was that? Jack didn't answer. He stood there for a long time, staring into the distance, before finally muttering, "Trouble." And just like that, I knew. Our peace was coming to an end. Jack had a feeling. A cold, unsettling feeling that clung to him like a shadow. He had lived with instincts sharpened by years of running, and tonight, they screamed louder than ever. The storm had settled over the town, rain pouring in thick sheets against the windows of the house. I sat in my rocking chair, knitting, while Robert leaned against the counter, sipping his tea. Jack was near the fireplace, staring into the flames, lost in thought. Lily had gone home hours ago, leaving behind the warmth of her laughter and the lingering scent of lavender. Jack was quieter than usual. More withdrawn. The easy way he had started to exist in this house, the playful teasing, the laughter, it had faded in the past few days. And I knew why. Something was coming. Or rather, someone. Jack suddenly looked up, his green eyes dark, unreadable. "Mrs. Adler, did anyone come by today? Anyone unusual?" I paused, setting my knitting down. "No, dear. Just the usual folk." "Why?" Robert raised a brow at Jack. "Something on your mind, son?" Jack hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. "Just being careful. That's all." But I knew he wasn't telling us everything. That night, the wind howled through the trees, making the house creak as though whispering secrets. Sleep wouldn't come easily for me, so I wandered downstairs for some tea. As I passed the living room, I caught sight of Jack, sitting by the window, his silhouette barely illuminated by the dim street lamp outside. He was watching. I followed his gaze, but all I saw was the empty road leading into town. "Jack?" His shoulders tensed before he turned to me, offering a tight smile. "Couldn't sleep." I walked over, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Neither could I." Jack hesitated, then sighed. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." I nodded, sitting beside him. "Do you want to tell me what it is?" For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then, in a low voice, he said, "He's here." I shivered. I didn't know who he meant, but the weight in his voice made my stomach turn. "Who, Jack?" He exhaled slowly. "Someone from my past. Someone dangerous. My fingers tightened around the edge of my shawl. And he's after you? Jack shook his head. Not just me. He'll hurt anyone he needs to. I swallowed hard, my heart heavy. Then we have to be ready. Jack's gaze softened. Mrs. Adler. I don't want you and Robert involved in this. Jack, I said firmly, this is our home. And as long as you're here, it's your home too. We protect our own. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Gratitude. Pain. Maybe even guilt. But before he could say anything else, a noise outside made us both go still. A slow, deliberate creak of the front gate. Jack moved before I could react, slipping into the darkness like a shadow. My breath hitched as I reached for the poker by the fireplace, my hands shaking. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure standing at the edge of the porch, just beyond the glow of the lantern. Waiting. Jack's voice was a whisper in the dark. Stay back, Mrs. Adler. Lock the door. I wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes told me there was no time. I stepped away, heart hammering, as Jack moved toward the door. Then, in the silence, a voice slithered through the night. Hello, Jackie boy. Miss me? It was the dead of night, and the house was eerily silent except for the faint creak of the rocking chair on our porch. My husband, Robert, had gone out to check on a noise near the barn, leaving me alone inside. I remember clutching my shawl tighter around my shoulders, anxiety settling into my bones. Something felt wrong. Jack had come home hours ago, quiet and withdrawn. Then, the scream shattered the night. It wasn't Robert's voice. It was distant but sharp, cutting through the quiet. My heart lurched, and before I knew it, I was rushing to the front door. Jack was already there, standing at the threshold, his body tense, as if he'd felt it coming. And then we heard it, a gunshot. Robert. I screamed, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran toward the barn. Jack was right behind me, his hand brushing against my arm as if he wanted to stop me but knew he couldn't. The moment we reached the barn, my worst fears were confirmed. Robert lay on the cold ground, blood pooling beneath his head. His rifle was a few feet away, untouched. There was no struggle, no chance to defend himself. Jack knelt beside him, his fingers searching desperately for a pulse, but I could see it in his face, he already knew. He looked up at me, those green eyes dark with something I couldn't place. No. I whispered, shaking my head. This can't be happening. Lily came running from the other side of the farm, her hands covering her mouth when she saw Robert. She fell to her knees beside me, her whole body trembling. Who? She choked out. Who did this? Jack's jaw tightened, his shoulders rising and falling with heavy breaths. I don't know, he said, but his voice was dangerously low. That was when we saw the tracks, footprints leading away from the barn, disappearing into the trees. Someone had been here. Someone had done this. But who? And why? Jack stood up slowly, his gaze following the tracks into the darkness. I knew that look. He wasn't just angry, he was calculating. Planning. And suddenly, I was afraid, not of whoever had done this, but of what Jack might do next. The night after the storm felt eerily quiet. The winds had settled, but an unsettling silence filled the air, as if the town itself was holding its breath. I sat on the porch, watching the moonlight stretch across the fields. My hands wrapped around a cup of tea, but its warmth did nothing to shake off the cold feeling creeping into my chest. Jack hadn't come back. I knew better than to ask questions, but I also knew trouble had been following him like a shadow. My heart clenched at the thought of him running into that man again. Lily had noticed too. She'd been quieter than usual, helping around the house but glancing toward the road every few minutes. The way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sweater gave away her worry. Then, as if the universe had heard our unspoken fears, a familiar silhouette appeared down the dirt path. Jack. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and stood up, but something in his walk made me freeze. He wasn't just tired, he was drained. Hollow. His usual sharp eyes were darker than the night sky, and his hands, which he usually kept steady, were clenched into fists. Lily reached him first. Jack, where have you been? His gaze softened for just a second at the sight of her, but it quickly vanished. Just had something to deal with. His voice was low, rough. He was holding something back. I stepped closer, my maternal instinct kicking in. Jack, tell me the truth. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, he exhaled heavily and looked me in the eyes. He's gone. The weight of those two words sank deep into my bones. There was no need to ask who he meant. Lily's breath hitched. Gone? What do you mean? Jack looked away. I handled it. Silence fell between us. I wasn't naive. I knew what he meant. The world was rid of that monster, but at what cost? I reached out, placing my hand gently over his. Jack. He flinched, like he wasn't used to being touched with kindness. My heart ached for him. This wasn't just about survival. He was carrying a weight heavier than any man should bear alone. Lily stepped closer, her eyes filled with worry and something deeper, understanding. Did anyone see you? Jack shook his head. No. But that doesn't mean it won't come back to haunt me. And he was right. The past had a way of catching up, no matter how far or fast you ran. I tightened my grip on his hand. We'll figure this out. You're not alone, Jack. For the first time since he arrived, his mask cracked just a little. His shoulders slumped, and a ghost of something, maybe relief, maybe exhaustion, flickered across his face. He nodded, just once, as if allowing himself to believe it. But deep down, we all knew this peace wouldn't last. There are moments in life when the silence around you speaks louder than words. That night, after the sheriff left and the town settled into its usual stillness, the weight of everything felt heavier. I sat by the window, staring at the road, half expecting Jack to appear from the darkness. But he didn't. Lillian sat across from me, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. She was trying to hold herself together, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She knew, just as I did, that things were only going to get worse. He's out there, isn't he? She whispered. I nodded. Yes, child. And he's not safe. Lillian exhaled a shaky breath and closed her eyes for a moment. He always knew this peace wouldn't last, didn't he? I looked at her, my heart aching. Jack's been running his whole life, dear. He was just hoping this time he wouldn't have to. The next morning, the news spread like wildfire. Old Tom, a farmer who lived near the outskirts, claimed to have heard something unusual the night before, voices raised in anger, the sound of a struggle. By noon, the sheriff had begun questioning folks, piecing together a puzzle none of us wanted to solve. Lillian and I remained silent. We knew what had really happened. Jack had killed the man who had haunted him, the one who had threatened our town, our lives. But the truth didn't matter, not in a place like this. Justice wasn't about what was right, it was about what people believed. And right now, the town believed that Jack had killed my husband. I wanted to scream at them, tell them they were wrong, tell them that if anyone deserved to die, it was that wretched man. But how could I? How could I tell them what had really happened without condemning Jack? Without making him a hunted man all over again? So I did the only thing I could. I stayed silent. That night, as I lay awake, listening to the creaks of the old house, I thought of him. I imagined him walking through the fields, his steps light, his heart heavy. I imagined the pain in his eyes as he realized he had to leave. And I imagined the sorrow he must have felt, knowing he would never see us again. Jack, my boy, wherever you are, I hope you know you were loved here. Even if the world didn't see it, even if they chose to believe the worst, I knew the truth. And so did she. The night was colder than usual, and I felt it in my bones. The house was quieter, emptier. Robert's chair by the fireplace remained untouched. He used to hum old tunes while whittling wood, filling the room with warmth. Now, only silence remained. And Jack, he was gone too. Lily sat across from me, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Her eyes were red, her face pale. She hadn't said much since Jack left. I knew she felt it just as deeply as I did. His absence was like a missing piece of our little world. He didn't do it, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I know, I said, staring into the flames. But it doesn't matter what we know, does it? She shook her head, her fingers gripping the ceramic cup tighter. They'll never believe us. And now he's alone out there, running again. My heart ached at the thought of him. The boy I had come to love as my own, the one who found shelter in our home, was once again a fugitive. Falsely accused. Hunted. The truth sat heavy on my chest. Jack hadn't killed Robert. He had killed the monster who did. That much I was sure of. He took justice into his own hands, and now he was paying the price for it. A knock on the door startled us both. Lily's breath hitched, and my own hands trembled as I set down my tea. It was late. Too late for visitors. I rose from my chair and approached the door cautiously, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I opened it, a gust of cold wind rushed in, but no one was there. Only the darkness of the night and a single object lying on the porch. A coin. An old, worn-out coin. I bent down, picking it up with trembling fingers. I knew what it meant. Jack had been here. Tears blurred my vision as I clutched the coin to my chest. He was saying goodbye the only way he could. Lily stepped beside me, staring at the empty night. He's still out there, she murmured. Somewhere. I nodded, wiping at my eyes. And I hope to God he finds his peace. For Jack, the road was never ending. But in my heart, he would always have a home.
Jack may be here, maybe right next to you.